And I get started here. Okay, welcome. Today we have an interesting sort of topic to go through. So my name is Dr. Khalil Andani, and I'm an assistant professor of religion. And today I'll be talking about an issue that's come up basically this week. And that particular issue is the nature of God's speech. So, as some of you may know, there's a lot of chit chat going on just in the last few days about Asharis and Salafis and the different views of divine speech. So, I have a sort of a slideshow to share with you guys. And there have been, you could say, certain polemicists, I think you know who they are, who've been claiming to present the Ashari Sunni view of divine speech in the Quran and pointing out several problems with the Ashari doctrine of the Quran and the divine speech. And this critique is coming from Salafis and one particular Salafi, and you guys all know who this person is. So what I found watching these videos and listening to the discussion is that the critique of the Ashari stance was missing a lot of important information, which I'm going to share. There are some, in my opinion, valid critiques of the Ashari views, but I don't think that Jake's presentation really hit at the real problems with the Ashari views of divine speech. And the second reason I'm doing this is that the view of the Salafis, which is basically the view of Ibn Taymiyyah on the speech of God, was not fully articulated in some of the videos that we've seen this week. And there have been Asharis who have responded to this. So you probably saw there's a video with Yasser Al-Hanafi and Shadi Al-Masri. They responded. There's a paper by Abdurrahman Mihrig. He responded in writing. So the Asharis have sort of risen to the challenge. But I want to share my thoughts on this as someone who studies this academically. As some of you may know, my PhD dissertation, which is being developed into a book, is on Muslim ideas of Quranic Revelation. That's basically what I specialize in. And I think as part of my own research, I have to sort of look at these different perspectives. And I'm just going to sort of share with you my understanding based on primary sources of the Ashari view and the Salafi view. So yeah, we can get started and get into this whole thing. So I have a short presentation, and that's, I'm going to try to keep this short to the point. I don't want to be long-winded. And after I share what I have to share, I will put a stream link where maybe people can join in and ask some questions if I can figure that out. So let's begin with the Ashari doctrine of divine speech. What do the Asharis believe on this topic, right? Like, what is their belief? And by the way, while those of you who are watching, you can feel free to post a question in the chat. I will see it and I'll respond to it. I'll try to address it. So you guys can do that. I can see the chat and everything that's going on. So let's begin with the Asharis. So the Ashari doctrine that I'm talking about here is what I like to call the classical Ashari doctrine. What does that mean? Well, this is the Ashari theology around the time of the 11th century, 10th, 11th century. So we're talking about the time of Ghazali. So 10th, 11th, 12th century Asharism. Because as many of you know, These traditions will later evolve. So we'll get a second kind of Ashari theology that will develop in the post-classical period. That's not my concern right now. So I'm going to use Ghazali mainly and Baqillani to articulate the Ashari position. So firstly, we need to remember that for classical Ashari theology, God is a single being, a single existent, who has at least 7 divine attributes, which are uncreated, eternal, but numerically distinct from God. Okay, this is what you need to remember. If you don't understand this, you will not understand how they believe in divine speech. So to put this in the form of a diagram, in Ashari theology, we have the divine essence, the that of Allah, all right? And then subsisting in the divine essence, we have several divine attributes. And at least 7 of those divine attributes are understood to be distinct numerically from the divine essence. Eternity is a bit of a different case where eternity is not really distinct from the divine essence, but all the other 7 are. And I'll talk about those details in a moment. However, what we should also be aware of is for Asharis, the actions of God, the acts of God like forgiving, guiding, punishing, rewarding, the actions of God are created. They are temporal. Okay, and this is what Ghazali says, and this is what Juwaini says as well. So again, to summarize, for Asharis, the divine attributes that subsist in God, those are called the attributes of God's essence. They are eternal because God is eternal. And one of those divine attributes, and you can see it in my diagram, one of the divine attributes that subsists in God's essence in Ashari theology is the speech of God. All right. This is a description of that divine attribute attributed to Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, according to the book, the Maqalat of Ibn Furak, who was a major sort of conveyor of al-Ash'ari's teachings in the 11th century. So, according to Abu Hasan al-Ash'ari, the speech of God is his eternal attribute, always subsisting in his essence. Okay, so the speech of God is eternal, it is uncreated, it is internal, you could say, to the divine essence. And then it says here, the speech of God is neither sound nor letters nor connected to outlets or instruments. So divine speech is a non-material, non-physical, non-temporal divine attribute for the Asharis. And the divine speech always subsists in the divine essence. So to put it more colloquially, God always has his speech. There is not a moment where God is not accompanied by his speech. Okay? This is really, really important to know because already, based on Ashari theology, the Ashari theologian can say that God is eternally speaking or God is always speaking. And this idea that God is an eternal speaker, it goes back to how Ashari thinkers define a speaker and define speech. And if you want to see this in more detail, you can go to my PhD thesis. But basically, one of the earliest disagreements between Asharis and Mu'tazilis was not merely about whether God's speech is created or uncreated. The first disagreement between Asharis and Mu'tazilis is about what is divine speech or what is speech in general. What is the definition of speech? And let me explain to you why this matters. For the Mu'tazilis or the Mu'tazilah, speech is defined as articulate and arranged sounds and letters. Qadi Abdel Jabbar defines speech, kalam, just like this, articulate or arranged sounds and letters. So for Mu'tazilis, speech is defined as a auditory physical reality. Then what is the definition of a speaker, of a mutakallim, according to the Mu'tazilis? According to them, the speaker or mutakalim is the maker, fa'il, of speech. That's the Mu'tazili definition of kalam, speech, and speaker, mutakalim. Okay? The Asharis do not agree with that definition. According to the Asharis, speech in general is defined as a ma'na, a entitative meaning that subsists qa'im in the self, be nafsihi or be nafs. Okay, so I'll repeat that. For Asharis, speech is defined not as sounds or letters, but as a meaning entity that subsists in the soul or in the self. In other words, to bring this home for you guys, when you speak, there's actually two layers of your speech, okay? One layer of your speech is what is the words that you communicate. But you could communicate in words, you could communicate in noises, you could communicate through sign language, you could communicate through drawing. So there's a difference between the form of communication, okay, which are the signs that you use to communicate. But then when you communicate something, there's an idea within your mind. There's a meaning content that you are trying to convey and signify through writing, speaking, drawing, and so on. So we have to differentiate between speech as meaning and speech as communication form. The Mu'tazilis take the form and they say that is speech. The Asharis go to the meaning of a communication and they say that is speech. All right, so that's really important. So far, the Asharis, based on the general definition of speech as a meaning or entitative meaning within the self, they define divine speech as an entitative meaning in the divine self or the divine essence. Okay, so far, that's how the Asharis define speech. What I'd like to ask people at this point is, are there any questions or confusions just on this issue, right? If there are, you can type it into the chat box. I think there's about 35 people watching this. You can put in the chat and I'll get to it. So what's next? Well, this is not the whole story for Ashari theology. Okay, Ashari theology they don't just say, okay, God's speech is an eternal attribute, and then go home. They have more to talk about. What about the revelation of that speech? Like, how do humans access divine speech? We obviously cannot access the divine essence, okay? Like, we can't perceive the divine essence, and we can't just normally perceive a divine attribute like speech. So let's keep going. So the Asharis then talk about a second created dimension of divine speech, which they refer to as the kira'ah, the recitation. Okay, what is that? Well, basically, what's going to happen, and I'll show that on the next slide. Okay, what's going to happen is God in creation is going to create a indication, a set of signifiers to disclose his uncreated speech to creatures. I'll repeat that. God is going to create within the creation indicators or signifiers to disclose his speech to creatures. Those created indicators or those created signifiers are what Asharis refer to as the created recitation of God's speech, the kira'at, kalam Allah. Okay, so the Quran, insofar as the Quran is a composition, a nazam, consisting of Arabic sounds, letters, and words in an arrangement, insofar as the Quran is an Arabic arrangement, the Asharis would refer to that Arabic arrangement as the created recitation of God's speech, okay? Not the divine attribute of speech itself. What's the relationship between the created recitation and God's uncreated speech? Basically, according to Asharis, the created recitation consists of indicators or signifiers, dalala, which point to, which refer to, and which convey something of God's uncreated speech that subsists in God's essence. Okay, so this is the Ashari view. So we have sort of like two levels of divine speech. All right, the uncreated divine speech is a divine attribute subsisting in God's essence, and we need to remember that the uncreated speech of God, it's not an abstract entity. Okay, it's not an abstract entity. It is concrete. It has concrete reality, and the uncreated speech of God contains meaning content. It contains amr, commands. It contains nahi, prohibition, and it contains khabar, information. Okay, so it's best to think about God's uncreated speech as eternal meaning content that subsists in God's essence for eternity. Okay, that's a good way to think about it. I'm going to turn to the chat here. Osgore asks, if God is always speaking to Asharis, does this mean God is still addressing Prophet Musa while there is no Musa? Yes, yes. Juwaini and Ghazali, they have both said that the address that God directs to Musa, that address as a meaning always exists. Okay, then when Moses comes into existence, and when he arrives at the appropriate time, that address that is eternally for Moses will be made known to Moses at a particular time in the life of Moses. That is what Juwaini says in Kitab al-Irshad, and this is also what Ghazali says in his book Al-Iqtisad. Okay, you'll find a whole discussion about this. So the answer to that question is yes. Somebody says, we should define what uncreated and created means. Okay, so for Asharis, whatever is uncreated is eternal, basically, and whatever is created is temporal and begins to exist. Okay, so because for the Asharis see all the 7+ divine attributes as eternal, they will refer to all of the divine attributes as uncreated because they're eternal, even though these attributes subsist in the divine essence. All right, so this is not the whole story, what I just said. This is just like the basic. What the video that Jake made was missing, okay? What his video is missing is he did not address the revelatory process by which Asharis understand God disclosing, revealing, or quote unquote sending down his divine speech to creation. Okay, Jake's video doesn't address that, and that is a major omission in my opinion. So we have somebody asking, do you think that the Salafi criticism against Asharis is a straw man? Yeah, I personally think it is a straw man, at least the criticism that I saw. I am happy to criticize the Asharis, but that type of criticism, in my books, it doesn't really hit the mark. There are more serious problems in Ashari theology that I would criticize, but what we saw in Jake's video is not one of them. So let's continue. Let's talk about now the rest of the Ashari story, which nobody is really talking about online so far. Even the Ashari speakers haven't really talked about this in much detail. Okay, before we go, Hello World asks, meanings are mental entities. So if they subsist within divine essence, then it follows the essence is mental. Okay, good question. When Asharis use the term ma'na for all the divine attributes, I do not believe they're talking about mental entities. Ma'na is related, of course, to the word ayn, right? And here, ma'na is more has the meaning of entity. okay, as opposed to meaning. So matna is not a proposition when it comes to divine attributes. The divine attributes are not propositions. So God's essence is not the locus of propositions. I don't think any Asharis ever believed that. All right. So if you consider divine attributes as mental entities, then those mental entities subsist in human intellects, if anything. They don't subsist in God. Okay. So Matna, in the Ashari sense of divine attribute, is more like an entitative reality, not a propositional meaning. It's a very good question, though. It's a very, very good question. All right, let's continue on this. The word Qur'an. For Asharis, the word Qur'an, as the word appears in the Qur'an and the Hadith, okay, the word Qur'an can have two meanings, okay? In a theological context, the word Quran is just a synonym for God's eternal uncreated speech. But in other contexts, okay, in the context of piety, in the context of practice, many times within the Quranic text itself and within the Hadith, the word Quran refers to the created Arabic recitation of God's eternal speech and not to God's eternal speech itself. Let me give you some examples. You all must be aware of hadith where Abu Bakr, Omar, and Zayd are having an argument because Omar orders Abu Bakr, who then orders Zayd to collect the Quran. And the word here is jama'a. Okay, he asks him to collect the Quran. Now, obviously, in that hadith about the collection of the Quran, the word Quran does not mean God's uncreated attribute that subsists in God's essence, because it's just absurd that Omar, Abu Bakr, and Zayd are going to collect a divine attribute. Okay, so obviously that's not what it means. Or, for example, you know, when the Quran is talked about within the Quran, so you have surah openings that say, for example, Ja'alna, we made it, Ja'alnahu, we made it an Arabic Quran, okay? Or Inna anzalnahu, we sent it down as an Arabic Quran. In these surah openings, Qur'an Arabian obviously does not refer to God's eternal uncreated attribute, because an uncreated attribute of God cannot be described as being in Arabic. It just makes no sense. So my point is, there are many usages of the word Quran in the Quran and the Hadith where the word Quran refers to the created Arabic recitation consisting of sounds, letters, and utterances, and not the divine attribute of speech. Let me give you another example. Recently, there was a big debate, right, between two Salafi Muslims. Well, one Salafi Muslim and one Maturidi Muslim, and Jay Dyer and Sam Shamoon on the Fresh and Fit show. And Sam Shamoon, and he's not the only one, him and a lot of the Christian polemicists, they used an argument where, according to the Hadith, the Quran appears as an old man on the Day of Judgment and intercedes for people. So the Prophet tells his community, you should recite the Quran, or you should recite these surahs of the Quran, because the Quran or the surahs will appear like birds or appear like a man on the Day of Judgment and intercede for you. Sam then said that if this hadith is true, God's eternal attribute will appear like a man and then intercede and plead with God himself. Okay, so that argument will not work in Asharism. Okay, because the Asharis will simply say that in that particular hadith, like in many hadith, the word Quran means the human creaturely act of recitation, and it does not refer to the divine attribute. Okay, and in many places it doesn't refer to the divine attribute. So we have to keep this in mind, okay, that Asharis have their own sort of terminology and they have their own hermeneutic. All right. Now, the next question is this. If God's speech, the uncreated speech, subsists in God's essence, and God's essence is transcending the creation, which obviously the Asharis believe this, how do humans get revelation? Okay. What does it mean for God to do tanzil or inzal? Tanzil and inzal literally mean to send down something. Both are transitive verbs, right? Tanzil is a form 2 verb of nazala, and inzal is a form 4 verb of the same root. So the Quran often talks about God sending down, either via tanzil or inzal, the kitab, which most people translate as book, but that would not work. The kitab, the divine prescription. Okay, many verses talk about Qur'an, al-Qur'an, being munazzal, being sent down. So how does that square with Ashari theology? Does God literally send down his eternal speech? Well, again, Asharis would say absolutely not. God's uncreated eternal speech is not subject to motion. So here's the explanation of Baqillani. Baqillani here, and this is directly from his book, Kitab al-Insaf. I've translated this passage in my doctoral dissertation. It's also going to be in my book. This is Baqillani's interpretation, tafsir in the loose sense of Surah 26, verses 193, 194, 195. As some of you know, Surah 26, verse 193 FF is a description of the Quran being sent down to the heart of the Prophet. All right, so here's what Baqillani says. What is sent down, al-munazzal, is the eternal speech of God, the exalted, eternal through his essence. And then he quotes that part of the Quran, right? It says, like, verily, it is a sending down, a tanzil from the Lord of the worlds. And then Baqillani qualifies what he just said. He says that this sending down is according to the sense which we explained. This being a descent, a nuzul, of causing knowledge, al-ihlam, and causing understanding, al-ifham, and not a descent of movement, haraka, and relocation, intiqal. Okay, so this is very clear. When the Quran says, according to the Asharis, that God sends down his speech, when the Quran says that God sends down his speech, it does not mean that the speech of God physically or materially comes down to earth. Okay, that is just ridiculous. It's completely ridiculous, according to the Asharis, according to me as well. So, the term inzal or tanzil, according to Baqillani, as well as according to Ghazali, according to Juwaini, according to Ashari himself, according to Ibn Furak, the term inzal or tanzil must be understood more symbolically as God making known or making understood his eternal speech. Okay, God is causing a creature to understand or to perceive his eternal speech. He's not physically sending or downloading the eternal speech into a creature, because that doesn't make any sense. All right, so let's continue reading the text. The recipient of the sending down, right, al-manzul ilayhi, is the heart of the prophet. That's also mentioned in the verse. And another time, I'll talk to you about this verse and how the Ismailis interpret it, because they interpret it in a somewhat different way. Then Baqillani continues, the means of what is sent down, al-manzul bihi, is the Arabic language by which Gabriel recites it, and we recite it until the day of resurrection. Okay, so now it's getting very interesting. Baqillani here is going to explain how exactly God's uncreated eternal speech is going to be disclosed, made known to creatures. And here is the key line. What actually descends, a nazil, what actually descends according to the reality of being moved from level to level, is the utterance, qawl, of Gabriel. What does that mean? Well, if you want to talk about inzal, sending down in a more literal sense, it is not the divine eternal speech attribute that physically comes down to earth. But what does physically come down from the heaven to the earth, according to Baqillani, is the Arabic utterance, qawl, of Gabriel. What does that mean? He goes on to explain the Arabic linguistic arrangement, an-Nazm al-Arabi. That's basically the Quran as an arrangement of Arabic letters, sounds, words, verses, and surahs. That's an-Nazm al-Arabi. So the Quran as an Arabic text, which is the Qira'at Kalam Allah, the recitation of the speech of God. So again, the Arabic text is not the speech of God itself. It is the created recitation of the speech of God. This Arabic text is the utterance, the qawl of Gabriel. Okay, how does that work? Gabriel learned or understood the speech of God. So Gabriel directly perceives the uncreated speech of God, because God causes Gabriel to understand God's speech. And then at the same time, God taught Gabriel the Arabic arrangement or the Arabic linguistic arrangement that comprises the Quranic text. Okay, so this is how it works. God reveals his eternal speech to Gabriel by causing Gabriel to understand his speech, and then God teaches Gabriel the Arabic recitation of that speech. So now Gabriel understands God's speech that's uncreated, and Gabriel is also taught by God the Arabic text of the Quran. So now Gabriel can go speak the Arabic Quran to the prophet. And it goes on to say, Gabriel taught the recitation to our prophet. The prophet taught it to his companions. All right, so that's what's going on. If you're confused by this, no problem. Let me teach you through my diagrams. All right, so what we have here is we have God, who has multiple eternal attributes. And then we have God's eternal speech, kalam Allah, beyond sounds and letters. Okay, this subsists in God's essence. Then God makes known his eternal speech to Gabriel. How does God do that? God creates within Gabriel faham, understanding, or ilm, knowledge. God creates an understanding within Gabriel so Gabriel can perceive God's eternal uncreated speech. Then God also teaches the recitation, that is the sounds, letters, words, and verses of the Quran to Gabriel. This happens at the same time. So Gabriel both understands God's speech and he knows the created recitation. And again, what is a created recitation? The recitation in Arabic consists of dalala, of signifiers or indicators that convey some of the meanings of God's speech. So Gabriel is taught that recitation, he's taught the significations, and then Gabriel conveys that Arabic recitation consisting of signifiers, which is created, to the prophet. The prophet understands the divine speech and conveys the created recitation to the community. So the Asharis, yes, they believe that God has an eternal speech, and they believe God is always speaking in the sense of God is always conveying eternal meanings. But this process from Gabriel onward, where God causes a creature to understand his speech, teaches him the recitation, that process is in time. Okay, the revelatory process happens in time. And we have to differentiate from an analytical perspective, and this is like this is part of my own thesis. There's a difference between revelatory principle, which would be God's eternal speech, revelatory process, which is how the eternal speech is disclosed to creatures, and revelatory product, which is the physical auditory product that we actually get access to. In this case, it would be the created recitation, the kira'at of this divine speech. And that created recitation is the Quranic text, whether that text is oral or written or in human memory, right? That text is created. Okay, the sounds, letters of the Quran, the grammatical structures of the Quran, even though Muslims believe that the Quran is a miraculous text, it is still a created text. Okay, it's a created text. All right, let's continue. So let's just summarize what we've done so far. And again, remember, the created recitation for the Asharis contains indicators which indicates to the eternal uncreated speech. So in God's eternal uncreated speech, we have meaning content. Okay, we have commands, we have prohibitions, we have information. And how those commands and prohibitions are disclosed to us is in the form of sentences, which form the created recitation. Okay. Here's a little summary. Okay, this is just the Ashari view now. God's speech is a meaning or entity that eternally subsists in his essence. For Asharis, remember, speech in general is defined as a meaning that subsists within a self. Mere sounds do not count as speech. And this was a good point that Shadi al-Masri and Yasser al-Hanafi made in their podcast this week. They said that if you define speech just as sound, then robots speak, okay? Then Siri speaks. Then, all sorts of things. Tape recorders speak because tape recorders emit sound, all right? Are we really going to say that? So I think they make a good point for the Ashari definition of speech, of kalam. So God's speech, which is not material and not physical, and it's not linguistic, it still has meaning content, commands, prohibitions, information, interrogation. For Asharis, God is always speaking. He is eternally speaking. He is mutakalim, lam yazal, for example. Okay, and because his speech is eternal, God's speech is azali, it is kadim, it is eternal in his essence. Now, look, I'm not an Ashari and I don't actually believe in this stuff, but we need to state their position as their sources state it. So, in my opinion, it is really not fair to say that according to Asharis, God doesn't speak, period. Okay, that's a straw man. Of course, God speaks according to Asharis. He just doesn't speak in the sense that you, the objector, whether you're Salafi or Mu'tazili, define speech. Okay, if you define speech as sounds and letters, then yeah, God in Asharism doesn't emit sounds and letters. But do you really want to take that position? Well, it's going to be funny because we're going to see in a few minutes somebody who did take that position and what sort of problems that leads to. But as far as I'm concerned, the Asharis are on firm ground when they define speech as meaning content and not as mere sounds. We should be aware that there were groups who defined speech in terms of sounds and letters only. Who are those groups? The Mu'tazilis, the Karamis, and the Salafis and the Taymis. Okay, so that's an interesting intersection, that the Mu'tazilis and the Taymis and the Salafis and the Karamis, they all define speech as sounds and letters. I guess they all have that in common, right? The Asharis, the Maturidis, they don't define speech in this way. Okay, Asharis and Maturidis, they define speech as a meaning content that subsists within a self. All right, now, after noting this, okay, we have to recognize that this is not the full story. God reveals his speech in particular temporal moments. God discloses that speech. He makes his speech accessible. And when God reveals his speech, for some creatures, he can cause the creature to directly understand his nonverbal speech. Okay, so Ashari books will talk about how God has caused Adam, Moses, Gabriel, and the Prophet Muhammad to get a direct understanding of his speech, okay, without sounds and letters. That's talked about. If you're interested, read my thesis, okay? I have Ashari thinkers being quoted on this. Secondly, the more general way that God reveals his speech is God creates linguistic indicators, dalala, of his speech in the form of a created recitation, which in the final revelation was in Arabic. Obviously, the revelation given to Moses, like the Ten Commandments, for example, or the Torah, that would be a created recitation of the divine speech in Hebrew. It's still a created recitation. And the Injil or the gospel that God revealed to Jesus, that probably would have been in Aramaic, right? So God does communicate his speech according to Asharis, and God communicates his speech in temporal moments. And these last 2 points we've gone over. So this is a summary, okay? This is a summary of the Ashari view. I'm not talking about the Hanbalis today. I'm only talking about Asharis and the Salafis or the Taymis. That's it, okay? Hanbalis, they're a different story. And so I'm just not going through them. All right, that's the end of part 1. Let's go to part 2. Next, I want to talk about the Salafi position. And by Salafi, I basically mean Ibn Taymiyyah's position. Okay, Ibn Taymiyyah's position. We have a question here from somebody. Does the Arabic originate in Gabriel or in God? Okay, the Arabic, the answer is both. For Ashari metaphysics, which is occasionalist, right? God is the creator of all actions. Okay, but if God creates something within you, then the act is still attributed toward you, even though God created within you. So in this case, we'll just go back a slide. In this case, God taught Gabriel the Arabic linguistic nazm or arrangement. God taught that to Gabriel. Again, in Ashari theology, how does God teach something to someone? He creates the knowledge within that person, his mind or his heart. So God created the knowledge of the Arabic Quran in Gabriel, but God didn't recite it to Gabriel, okay? In Ashari theology, God doesn't recite the Quran, the Arabic Quran. The first entity to recite the Arabic Quran is Gabriel, not God. This is a very, very key point, okay? I'm going to repeat it. In Ashari theology, God does not recite the Arabic linguistic arrangement that makes the Arabic Quran. God is not a reciter. God is not a qari, okay? Gabriel is the first reciter. God, of course, is still the source of the Arabic Quran. Why? Because God created the entire knowledge of the Arabic Quran, the Nazm, in Gabriel. So it's not like Gabriel just like makes it up, okay? God is creating it in him. So God is still the source of both the eternal divine speech and the Arabic recitation of that speech, but they come about through, different processes, you could say. Can we say to the Asharis, God made a kind of telepathy with Gabriel? I don't know if I would use the word telepathy. However, there are Ashari scholars. So if memory serves me right, there are scholars like Badruddin al-Zarkashi and Jalaluddin as-Suyuti, and they both wrote books under the genre of Ulum al-Quran. And I believe both Zarkashi and Suyuti say that one of the beliefs is that God inspired the Quran to Gabriel. i.e., God conveyed the Quran through nonverbal means, which actually would match what I'm talking about here. So they call that word is ifham. So one of the beliefs among Asharis is that God inspired the Quran through nonverbal means. He taught the Quran to Gabriel without actually reciting the Quran. And that's Baqilani's position. Now, this is not the only Ashari position, okay? I'm not going to get into it, but another account of the revelatory process in Asharism is that God created the letters of the Quran on the guarded tablet before creation, or at the first moment of creation, or sometime on there. Okay. So another option is God wrote the Quran by creating letters on the guarded tablet. And the guarded tablet is created, by the way. And then Gabriel learned the Quran by memorizing it off the guarded tablet. That's another account. Okay. But I don't want to get into that. Let's go to part 2. So we did our little review, right? And now let's switch. Let's survey Ibn Taymiyyah's view of God's speech and the Quran. And there's a reason why I'm doing this. What I noted in Jake's video and even the Ashari responses to the video is nobody really went into detail on what the Salafi Tami view of divine speech is. And in fact, we have someone asking this, is the non-Kalami view of the Hanbalis not the same as the Taymi view? No, it's not. It's actually not, at least as far as I'm concerned. Okay, it's not. So what is that? What is the Taymi view? Well, the best way to get the Taymi view is to read Ibn Taymiyyah. So that's what I did. And I had to do this for my research anyway. I have to talk about Ibn Taymiyyah's view. So let's switch to Ibn Taymiyyah. All right. Well, actually, first, I said that I had problems with the Ashari view. So let me talk about that first. All right. And look, it's not a secret that I oppose Ashari theology out of my own principles. Okay. I'm a Muslim philosopher, and there are metaphysical views that I hold. And I've not been shy to make my disagreements with Ashari or Maturidi or anybody's theology known. So let me just share some of my objections to Ashari theology of divine speech. So first, for the Asharis, God's speech is numerically distinct from God's essence and is super added to God's essence. And this is the case for all of the divine entitative attributes, the sifat ma'nawiya that Asharis believe in. All of the sifat ma'nawiya, all of the entitative divine attributes are numerically distinct from God. They subsist in God's essence, and they are za'ida, super added to God's essence. Okay, then I go back to my diagram. I have a problem with this on metaphysical and philosophical grounds. Okay, I think this position is problematic. The Asharis say that, well, look, God's attributes, they're not identical to God, but they're not separate from him either. Okay, I accept that. But there is a real distinction between each of the 7 divine attributes and God's essence. There's a real distinction. I'm not claiming that they're separate. You can attach them all together, no problem. 2 things can be attached, i.e., they can be found always together, but they're not identical. And that's the problem. So basically, God's essence is not identical to God's speech. God's speech is not identical to God's life, and so on. This means that for Asharis, and let me qualify, for classical Asharis and those who still follow that tradition, i.e. the Juwaini, Ghazali, Baqilani tradition, for those Asharis, you have real multiplicity within God. You cannot deny this. You have real multiplicity, because when you make distinctions using the law of identity, and by applying the law of identity, you say X is not identical to Y. As soon as you do that, you commit yourself to multiplicity. So we have one divine essence, and then we have several attributes subsisting within the divine essence. This becomes a problem. So are we going to say that, well, firstly, is God, Allah, many things? Is God many realities? Because that's what you're committing yourself to. Each attribute is not identical to the essence. So when you say the word Allah, or when you say Ya Allah, or Allahumma, or Allahu Samad, or Allahu Alim, whatever you say, whenever you say Allah, are you not referring to a multiplicity or a conglomerate of uncreated realities? It would seem to me that you are. And before you come and say that, oh no, you're strawmanning us, well, here is what your Imam Ghazali says in Al-Iqtisad. So he says, it's translated as moderation belief. If we say God, the exalted, right? So if you say Allah, the exalted, then we have referred to the divine essence together with the divine attributes and not to the essence alone. So already the phrase Allah, according to the Ashari Theology of Ghazali, it refers to a real multiplicity. It doesn't refer to a unity. It refers to, at best, a composite unity of a divine essence and divine attributes. Then it gets even worse for the Asharis when Ghazali is trying to interpret the statement that I have above: God's attributes are not identical to him and not other than him. And other here means not separate from him. Ghazali compares the divine attributes to the body parts of a human. He says, just as God's attributes are not him and not other than him, Zayd's hand is not Zayd and not other than Zayd. And then he says, every part is not other than the whole, nor is it the same as the whole. Okay, this means God in Ashari theology is composite. God is murakkab. And I know for a fact that Asharis also say God is not murakkab, right? No Ashari actually says God is composite, but I'm afraid that your theology of real distinct attributes that are za'ida, super added to the divine essence, I'm afraid that that commits you to a God who's composite. And I don't mean any offense by this. I'm saying this as a Muslim philosopher who writes and forms arguments about these topics. This is just my take. So to me, this is the real problem with Ashari theology. Not this idea that, oh, God doesn't emit sounds. I applaud Asharis for not believing that God emits sounds. I applaud you for that. I applaud Asharis for believing that God is timeless. But if I were going to attack your theology or critique your theology, this is the way that I would be doing it. And now I know what you're going to say. Some of you are going to say that, oh, this is like a fallacy of composition or something like that. And, like parts do not imply composition. I can make this argument without resorting to composition. And I've done it before. As soon as you say that the divine essence is not identical even to one attribute, okay, then you need to tell us, does the divine essence depend on the divine attribute and the attribute doesn't depend on anything? Is that what you're saying? In which case the divine essence is dependent, and that means God is dependent. Or are you saying that the divine attribute depends on the divine essence and the divine essence is independent? This is what your scholar Al-Taftazani said. Is that what you're saying? If that's what you're saying, then I would argue that the dependent divine attribute, which you call uncreated, is actually created because it's dependent. It's in need of another, right? It lacks self-sufficiency to subsist on its own. So if you say God's attribute depends on God's essence, then I would just tell you that what you're calling a divine attribute is actually an emanation or an eternal creation. It's not really an attribute. Or are you going to say that God and his attribute are codependent? Then I would say that you have run into a vicious circularity where you just have pure dependency and you have no independent reality, and that's not going to work. Like, you might as well give the game to the atheists who believe in an infinite regress of contingent or dependent realities. You might as well just tell them that they're right and go home. Or fourthly, maybe you say that the divine essence and the divine attribute are both dependent on some other third reality. Okay, well, then that third reality is going to be God, and the divine essence is going to be created, contingent, and the divine attribute is going to be contingent. All right. So that's my problem. Okay. Like if I had to critique Ashari theology, and again, none of the Ashari commentators this week, none of them have addressed this. And then to be fair, Jake didn't really bring it up, so maybe that's why. But I'm bringing it up now. All right. My other problem, and this is more of a worry, and I'm sure maybe Asharis can answer this question. How can God's speech be a single attribute when it comprises an infinite number of meanings, commands, prohibitions, and this sort of thing? Like God's speech as an attribute, it contains meaning content. And I mean, it potentially contains infinite meaning content. But then how can this be one attribute? And, you can do some work on this question. I think there are some ways to answer this, so I'm not claiming this is a defeater, but this is something that I would want to ask. Is God's attribute of speech, does it contain itself propositional content? Then you'd have like an infinite number of propositions, or what is that content? So this is not really explained as far as I can tell, okay? And maybe somebody can answer this. So anyway, these are my problems with the Ashari theology of divine speech. They're not my only problems, but this is like the highlight of what my problems would be. So now I'm going to move on. So, we've gone about an hour and I don't want to be too long. So let's shift. Let's talk about the Salafi view. And I'm just going to say Salafi view, but I really mean Ibn Taymiyyah's view. And I'm pretty sure today's Salafis follow Ibn Taymiyyah's view. All right. So let's talk about what did Ibn Taymiyyah teach on this topic of divine speech? Because again, Jake doesn't really tell you much. In fact, none of the Salafis tell you the details of Ibn Taymiyyah's view. So I went through his work, and sorry, my TikTok is asking me to do something here. I'm streaming this on my TikTok, and it thought I was trolling or something. Okay, so Ibn Taymiyyah's view. We need to begin with the bigger picture of Ibn Taymiyyah's theology. All right, the bigger picture of Ibn Taymiyyah's theology. So what is his view of the divine attributes? Now, based on my analysis, and I am more than happy if an Ibn Taymiyyah scholar challenges me on what I'm about to say. I'm more than happy. You're free to do it. I'd love to chat with you. I'm not a specialist on Ibn Taymiyyah. People like Carl Sharif and John Hoover, Farid Suleiman, they're the specialists of Ibn Taymiyyah. But I am trained in Islamic intellectual history, and I've applied my training to the analysis of Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is what I found. And if you think I'm wrong, no problem. I welcome your critique. But this is what I've been able to ascertain thus far in my reading of Ibn Taymiyyah, as well as some of the secondary literature by John Hoover. As far as I can see, Ibn Taymiyyah has the idea of God being one essence, and this one essence has numerically distinct attributes, but he categorizes the divine attributes differently than the Asharis and the Maturidis and even the Hanabila. So as far as I can tell, for Ibn Taymiyyah, God has some number of essential attributes, and they would definitely include life, knowledge, power, and will. All right. And these are like the sifat datiya, for example. Now, could he have more in this bucket? Probably, but he definitely has these in the bucket. So these are the essential attributes, and these attributes, for the most part, are timeless. There is some debate over whether God's knowledge is actually timeless, but let's just say it is for now. So you have these timeless attributes of God's essence. And again, they are numerically distinct. Ibn Taymiyyah rejects divine simplicity. So his view of the attributes is that they are distinct, from each other and God's essence. Now, this is not the whole thing. Ibn Taymiyyah has a second category of divine attributes, okay? The second category is what he calls voluntary attributes. These are divine attributes of action, okay? Basically, these are temporal actions. These are things that God does in time. These attributes are called sifa al-ikhtiyariya, okay? The voluntary attributes. And this is what Ibn Taymiyyah says about the voluntary attributes. The voluntary attributes are affairs by which the Lord is qualified or described. May he be glorified and exalted. Thus, they, the voluntary attributes, subsist in his essence by his will and his power. Let's pause there. What Ibn Taymiyyah is telling us is that God has two sets of attributes, the essential attributes and then the voluntary attributes. And there is a sort of dependence relation, or there's a sort of contingent relation between the voluntary attributes and God's will and power. That is to say, the voluntary attributes are subservient to and dependent upon these two attributes of will and power. Okay, this is really different from our Ashari friends. Okay, I'm not aware of Asharis giving different priority levels or different levels of authority to God's entitative attributes. I'm not aware of it. Okay, but Ibn Taymiyyah clearly is. Now, what are the voluntary attributes? Well, he gives you a list, such as his speech, his hearing, his sight, his intention, his love, his pleasure, his mercy, his anger, his wrath. The list actually continues. I've cut it off at this point. So there are many voluntary attributes. And again, we could better conceive these as divine actions. Okay. You could call them divine actions if you want. These are divine actions ad intra, to use our Christian friends' terminology. God has divine actions that are ad intra, that are internal to his essence, and that's why those divine actions are called voluntary attributes. And he says very clearly, they subsist in his essence. God's voluntary attributes are multiple, they subsist in his essence. Imagine who would have a problem with that. Okay. One of those voluntary attributes of God for Ibn Taymiyyah is God's speech. Okay, and I've highlighted that over here. One of the voluntary attributes is God's speech act. I'm translating this as speech act because this is how we need to properly understand. For Ibn Taymiyyah, divine speech is an act. It's not an essential attribute in the way the Asharis believe in it. It's not an eternal attribute that subsists. It's a temporal action. God speaks by his will and power, and his speech is uncreated. Okay? And it subsists in God's essence, but it is uncreated. Now, I'm going to get into this. What does Ibn Taymiyyah mean by uncreated? We're going to get to it. But this is what you should know for now, that God's speech for Ibn Taymiyyah is a voluntary attribute. And that means God's speech is subject to God's power and God's will. Let's go more into the details of this. Quoting Ibn Taymiyyah, again, I have the full references here, right? This is Majmu' al-Fatawa, volume 12. All right, I have the page number. You are free to go in, check my translations if you think I'm misrepresenting anything. So, God's speech is an action. And how does that relate to the Quran? So this is what Ibn Taymiyyah says. The Quran is the revealed, the munazzal, speech of God, uncreated. They said, the Salaf said, that God is speaking when he wills from eternity. Now, what Ibn Taymiyyah means by this is not that God is always speaking, but he thinks from eternity past, okay, God occasionally speaks. Okay, so from eternity past, God issues temporal speech acts. He goes on to say that The speech of God is eternal, meaning its genus is eternal. But none of them say that a particular speech itself is eternal, nor did he say, the Salaf say, that the Quran is eternal. They said that the revealed speech of God is uncreated, and since God would speak the Quran by his will, the Quran is his speech, and it was sent down from him and uncreated. But the Quran, is not beginningless. That is, it is not azali. It is not eternal, kadim, with the eternity of God. All right, so let's unpack this. What Ibn Taymiyyah is saying is God's speech act is temporal. It began to exist. So the Quran began to exist. And by the Quran, he actually means the Arabic sounds of the Quran. Okay, he means the sounds and letters. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, God spoke the Quran. The Quran is God's speech act. The speech act of God, whether it's the Quran or the Torah or the Gospel or what God said to Moses, God's speech act is temporal. It began to exist. The technical term would be hadith or muhdath. But Ibn Taymiyyah also says God's speech act is uncreated. Well, wait a minute. How can something be uncreated and have a beginning? Right? Isn't it not the case that whatever begins to exist must be created? Certainly the Asharis thought so. Certainly the Hanbalis thought so. Certainly the Maturidi's thought so. Even the philosophers would say that if something begins to exist, then it's created. Ibn Taymiyyah says no. For Ibn Taymiyyah, something can begin to exist, but be uncreated, because if something begins to exist, but it subsists within God's essence, then you cannot call it created. You must call it uncreated. I'm going to repeat that in case you're having trouble. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, if something begins to exist, but it subsists in the essence of God, then that thing is uncreated. It is not created. For something to be created, it must begin to exist and subsist outside of God's essence. So if God, creates a tree, okay, and that tree subsists on planet Earth, the tree is created. But if God does an action like speaking the Quran, and the Quran, after it's been spoken, subsists within God, then you have to say that the Quran is uncreated. This is Ibn Taymiyyah's view. So we're dealing with the idea of an uncreated yet temporal divine speech, which is identical to the Quran, as well as any other temporal speech God has issued. That's what we're dealing with. This is really difficult for people to understand. Okay, our Ashari and even the Mu'tazilis and the Maturidis and even the non-Taymi Hanbalis, okay, they would all oppose this. They would all oppose Ibn Taymiyyah on this. The only group that I think would agree with Ibn Taymiyyah on this idea of an uncreated temporal action would be the Karamiya. Do you guys know who the Karamiya are? They're a now dead, extinct sect of Sunnis who were active in the 11th century in, I think, in Persia and Central Asia. Okay, the Karamis. They had the same view as Ibn Taymiyyah on God's speech being a temporal action that subsists in God's essence and is uncreated. They have the same view. And Ibn Taymiyyah actually attests to the Karami view in the same book that I'm quoting. All right, so let's continue. So what is this uncreated Quran that began to exist? Like, is this the same Quran that we have on earth? Like, does it look the same? Does it sound the same? This is where, honestly, Ibn Taymiyyah, in my view, he says some things which, as far as I can tell, are not coherent. But let's see what he actually says. So, God spoke the Quran, and what God spoke is uncreated. And what does that consist of? According to Ibn Taymiyyah, and I'm going to show you in the bold here, God spoke with his own sound and his own letters, all of which are uncreated. So this is saying that God's direct speech, which would include the Quran, it is in the form of sounds and letters, but these sounds and letters are from God's own nafs, God's own self. Okay? Similarly, God is going to speak on the day of judgment, and he's going to speak to us with sound. And God spoke to Moses also using sounds. And these sounds that God utters, they are unique to God. He calls them God's own sound, his own sound. Now, this is very mysterious. What is the meaning of God speaking with his own sounds and his own letters? Like, are God's sounds and letters the same thing as our sounds and letters? Well, Ibn Taymiyyah says no. He says at the top here that the speech of the servant, that's us, is created. Okay? And the names and letters in human speech is created. What he does say is he says that there are analogs, that is naziruha, there are analogs, so there's some sort of correspondence between human speech and divine speech, but he doesn't tell you what it is. Okay, let's keep going. So what we know now is, just it's all summarized on my diagram. God has a speech act. It is a voluntary attribute of God. Speech act is a temporal action. It's uncreated because it subsists in God, and it consists of sounds and letters that are God's sound and letters. And I don't really know what that means, but let's keep going. So God spoke the Quran with uncreated sounds and uncreated letters, but what's the relationship between God's sound and our sound? So like when I say Kul huwallahu ahad, or Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, or Inna ladhina yubayyunaka, Innama yubayyunallaha. When I say the Quran, is that the same sound and letters that God spoke the Quran? Well, apparently not. So according to Ibn Taymiyyah, the sound that we make when we recite the Quran is created. And he even notes that Ahmed ibn Hanbal, he condemned people who say that your utterance of the Quran is created. But Ahmed never said that whoever says the sound of the Quran is created is a heretic. Okay? So for Ibn Taymiyyah, the sounds that we humans make when we recite the Quran, those are created sounds. But God recites the Quran with uncreated sounds. Okay? And he says that at the end here, the actions by which the servant recites and writes God's speech, such as their sounds and their ink, those are created. So actually, the Quran that you hear on earth, its sounds are all created. But God spoke the Quran with uncreated sounds and uncreated letters. And the real question is, what's the relationship? What is the relationship between the created sounds that we make? When I say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, I just made created sounds. But is that exactly what God spoke? Did God say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim? It seems to me that we don't have a sure way to know that. Ibn Taymiyyah goes on to say, same book, again, I'm quoting directly. He tells us here, again, that the Quran does not multiply in, and I don't know whether it says here itself or God's self. The text is a bit ambiguous. So he says there's only one Quran, but many people are reciting the Quran. Okay? So he says here that the Quran in God's self, in its utterance and its meaning, is what God spoke. And then Gabriel heard it, and then Gabriel spoke it to the prophet spoke it to everybody else. So he's trying to tell us here that there's only one Quran, and that one Quran is the Quran that subsists within God. That's the uncreated Quran. But what about the Quran that is voiced by humans, or the Quran that is written by humans? Isn't that Quran created? Because the sounds and the writing is created. So let's continue. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, God spoke the Quran in Arabic through his own sound, and he spoke to Moses through his own sound. And then he says here, God's sound does not resemble anything of the sounds of the creation. Then he says, when we recite the Quran, we only recite it with our created sounds, which does not or do not resemble the sound of the Lord. And the Quran, which we recite, is the speech of God, which we proclaim without it being something heard from him. So what he's basically saying here is the Quran that we recite consists of created sounds, and we do not actually hear the Quran from God. But the Quran that God recited is with uncreated sounds and uncreated letters, and there is no resemblance, there is no tamthil between God's sound and our sounds. So in a sense, Ibn Taymiyyah's position entails that he actually believes in two Qurans. Okay, I'll repeat that. For Ibn Taymiyyah, it appears that there are two Qurans. There's an uncreated Quran subsisting in God, which consists of uncreated sounds and letters. And then there's a created Quran that we have access to, that we recite, that we write, that we memorize. And the created Quran is comprised of created sounds. And then he says there is no resemblance between the uncreated Quran in its sounds and the created Quran with its sounds. There's just no resemblance. I mean, to me, this seems like a big problem. How does Ibn Taymiyyah even know that these two Qurans are related? Like, we seem to have no way to even verify this, because none of us can hear God's uncreated voice or his uncreated sounds. So in my opinion anyway, Ibn Taymiyyah's understanding of divine speech like just becomes a mystery at the end of the day, or it might just reduce to something incoherent. So here's a summary of the Ibn Taymiyyah position. All right, just if you were confused. So I'm just going to go through the summary. God's speech act is a temporal or voluntary attribute of divine action, and it occurs by God's will and power. So God's speech is subservient to God's will and power. Ibn Taymiyyah would agree, that speech subsists in the self of the speaker. That's part of his definition of divine speech. The difference is that for Ibn Taymiyyah, speech consists of sounds and letters. For Asharis, speech consists of a meaning. But both Ibn Taymiyyah and Asharis tell us that speech, whatever it is, subsists in the self of the speaker. This is why Ibn Taymiyyah says that God's speech of uncreated sounds and letters subsists within God. Okay, you saw that in the quotes. All right. Ibn Taymiyyah also believes that God's speech acts, one of which is the Quran, are temporal. So the Quran begins to exist. It is hadith. It is muhdath. In English, we would say the Quran is emergent, or it is occurrent, or it is incipient. Incipient might be the best word. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, the Quran is incipient, it is emergent, and yet it is also uncreated, not because it's eternal, but because it subsists in God's essence. Okay, that's what it is. For Ibn Taymiyyah, because God's speech acts are temporal, God is not always speaking. There will be times when God is silent, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. This is just what is entailed by his idea that God's speech acts are not eternal and that they are temporal. Ibn Taymiyyah and the Salafis have to admit that God sometimes is speaking and sometimes he's silent. All right, continuing on this. God spoke the uncreated Quran, again, not eternal Quran. God spoke the uncreated Quran with his own sounds and his own letters. Okay, his own sounds and letters. Now we're getting into something really mysterious because I have no idea what that means. What in the world would an uncreated sound and an uncreated letter be? And if you're just going to tell me that, with bila kayf, like we don't know, then this language is sort of meaningless. This becomes gibberish. And it gets even worse when Ibn Taymiyyah says God's sounds and letters have no resemblance to created sounds and letters. And yet, the sounds and letters uttered by human beings are created. And of course, this whole entire paradigm, in my opinion, is going to lead to some problems. And these are problems that at least the Asharis in their own theology, the Asharis, they have ways to address some of these issues. I don't think Ibn Taymiyyah has ways to address these issues. And let me go through the issues. So my issues with Ibn Taymiyyah's view. Number one, God's action attributes, all of the voluntary attributes of God are temporal. This entails a composite God because all these attributes are numerically distinct. They all subsist in God's essence. So God is composite. And to be fair, the Asharis have a problem too. But for Ibn Taymiyyah, God is composite and he changes. So these actions like creating, seeing, sitting, istiwa, forgiving, hearing, all the descending, nuzul, speaking, these are actions, they happen in time, and after they happen, they subsist in God. So God's essence becomes a substrate for temporal actions or temporal accidents known as hawadith. And this basically means God is in time. It also means that God is in a state of flux, because if God is a substrate, if his essence is a substrate for temporal actions, right, then not only is there change in the temporal actions, i.e., not only is there a change in God speaking, right? God has more speech subsisting in his essence than 2,000 years ago, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. I mean, that's the entailment of his view, right? Everything that God speaks subsists in his essence. So today, there is, if you assume the Quran is the last instance of divine speech, today there is about 6,000 words, approximately. There are 6,000 words more of divine speech subsisting in God's essence than before the Quran was revealed. So not only is the divine speech temporal, but then God's essence becomes temporal because that divine essence is different, okay, before he speaks the Quran and after God speaks the Quran, okay? Before God speaks the Quran, the divine essence is in a certain state where it's not a receptacle for the Quran, but after God spoke the Quran over 23 years in Ibn Taymiyyah's theology, the divine essence now is a substrate for the Quran. So that would mean the divine essence is also changing from state to state, from hal to hal. This, I think, makes God completely temporal. A related issue is, how can you call something both uncreated and temporally emergent, that is beginning to exist? On the face of it, this sounds incoherent. It sounds like a contradiction. Even Shadi al-Masri and Yasser al-Hanafi commented on this. They said it's like saying water is not wet, or something is liquid but it's not wet. That's the comparison they made. So this is, at least it's very unclear, if not problematic. And of course, some of my objections to Ashari theology would also apply to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah has divine attributes that are distinct from the divine essence. The same argument that I make against the Asharis will apply to Taymian theology as well. And again, I've yet to hear a proper response from Jake or anybody to my argument. All right. What in the world is an uncreated sound or letter spoken by God? What is that supposed to mean? Like, can somebody explain this to us? What meaning is there in talking about God speaking with an uncreated voice? Is this auditory, right? Is this something that is like sonic or something? Like, what are we talking about? So again, this will retreat into Mysterianism. Where do God's uncreated sounds and letters come from? Does he create them or does he generate them? That would mean God's speech is like totally composite as well. It's comprised of uncreated sounds and letters that are arranged in a certain way. And are all these uncreated sounds and letters now subsisting in God's essence? I mean, how many things do you have floating around in God's essence now? Because every temporal, voluntary attribute is subsisting in God's essence, right? Every divine action is subsisting in God's essence. So you call it uncreated. Since God's letters and sounds have no resemblance to created letters and sounds, how can any created being even know that what they are actually reciting of the Quran is the same as God's speech? Okay, because this is basically saying that the Quran that God spoke, which is inside God's essence, this Quran does not resemble the Quran that we recite, because we recite a Quran and we emit created sounds. God recites the Quran and God emits uncreated sounds, and there's no resemblance. So, for all I know, the Quran that we are reciting is a completely different phenomenon than the Quran that God spoke and subsists in him. Okay, so this is a big problem with the Taymian view. Now, of course, what Ibn Taymiyyah has said, and it's in my quotes, and I'll go back to these, what Ibn Taymiyyah has said is that the letters existing within the Quran, okay, they have analogs, naziruha, in our speech, in other speech. Okay, so that's what he resorts to. He claims that the letters and the words in the Quran that God spoke have analogs in other speech, but he doesn't really tell you like what is the relationship between the divine letter and the divine sound and its created analog, right? So he wants to tell us that there's a correspondence between the two, but he doesn't tell us what exactly the nature of the correspondence is. So this is a big problem, in my opinion, with the Taymian view. All right. So that's basically the end of what I had to share, and I didn't want to take too long, but I guess we've gone an hour and a half now. What we could do is, if I can figure this out, I can invite people to participate in the stream. If my StreamYard enables that, we can maybe call up guests. If I can find that. Otherwise, what you guys can do is you can write in the chat. And I can answer questions. Yeah, it looks like I don't have the, I don't seem to have the option here to share the link to this thing to have people come up. At least I don't know how to do that. All right, so I'll take chat audience questions. So look at my TikTok over here. See what's going on. So if you have questions, you can put the question in the YouTube chat, and we can sort of take it from there. I thought StreamYard had an option. Oh, here we go. I got it. Okay. So here's what I'm going to do now. I am going to put, you guys can come to the stream. All right. So I'm going to put a link here, and I'll try to pin it. Show. There we go. I've started. So if you want to come up and you can ask a question, we're going to try to keep it on topic because I think that would be good. We did that. So let's keep it on the topic that we're discussing. All right, I've pinned the message. So there you go. If you'd like to come up and chat. All right, we have somebody here. Oh, we have a couple of people. All right, so again, we're gonna discuss this topic. If you have a question about other topics, or if you're just here to attack Islam or whatever it is, then this is the wrong time to do that. So we have somebody here. Let me put you on the stage. Hello.
Hello. Good afternoon.
How are you?
Doing good. How are you?
I'm good. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us insights about this topic. My question is, when Moses talked to Allah in Quran Surah 28:30 Al-Qasas, is it uncreated speech or created? Because Moses talked directly. If he didn't read anything. So speech of Allah directly heard by Moses, is it created or uncreated? Because Allah who speak without any mediator in a sense. Can you explain it, please? According to Ashari, and also maybe Ibn Taymiyyah maybe address it. Thank you, Dr. Khalil.
Sure. I'm happy to. So I'm just going by my memory of what I've written. So firstly, do you remember the verse number? It's Surat Al-Qasas. Do you know which verse?
30.
30. Okay, let me just go to it, and just so I can be more specific.
Because he said there is, I am Allah. So nobody else speak other than Allah. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So let's start with what the Asharis would say. Okay. So what the Asharis would say is that God created sounds. God created a voice. Okay. And those created sounds, that's what Moses heard. And then Moses understood, through hearing the sound, he understood the meaning. That's what the Asharis would say. Okay, so God can make somebody understand a meaning, and all the meanings are within God's eternal speech, right? So for example, it says here, right, like, oh Moses, like, I am Allah, right? Or indeed I am Allah, the Lord of the world. So that's a particular meaning. Okay, that meaning, verily I am Allah, the Lord of the worlds, that meaning is eternally within God's speech for Asharis. It's eternally within God's speech, and that God's speech is within God. So that speech as a meaning is always there. But Moses, he came to the fire at a particular time, and at the moment that God wanted Moses to understand that meaning, God creates a voice, and that voice probably would have consisted of sounds within a language that Moses knows. So Moses then hears a voice, and he hears, probably in Hebrew or whatever language, right? I am Allah, and then Moses understands the meaning of that, and that's how he gets access to the eternal meaning that is in God's speech. That is how the Asharis will explain that verse. Okay, and to be clear, when I'm looking at the verse, it says Moses like heard something, coming from the tree, basically, right? Like it says, like he heard something from the tree. So that's how the Ashari explanation. For Ibn Taymiyyah, he would probably say that God spoke in time directly to Moses. But I'm not sure how Ibn Taymiyyah would explain how Moses can understand something in God's voice when God's voice has no similarity to a created voice. So I'm not aware of how Ibn Taymiyyah is going to explain like this direct voice of God to Moses, but he does say, and if we went back to our slides, he did say that when God addressed Moses, it was with his own voice. Ibn Taymiyyah did say that. I have the quote right here. The sound which Moses heard from him is not like the sound of something created. So for Ibn Taymiyyah, God did speak to Moses in God's voice, which is sort of totally mysterious. So yeah, they have different approaches to your question. They would have, the Asharis and Ibn Taymiyyah would have different answers.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like the Ashari will think like there is a copy that eternally inside of Allah, and when Moses talked to him, and then at that time it was created. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so Asharis will say that in Allah's eternal speech, there is a meaning, and it's the meaning of the statement, I am Allah, the Lord of the worlds, as a meaning that always exists. When Moses came to the right time and place, God caused Moses to understand that meaning. One way God can make Moses understand the meaning is by creating a voice that Moses hears. But to be honest, Asharis can also say that God created the perception of the meaning within the soul of Moses without using a voice.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Khalil, and I can leave now.
Okay.
I appreciate your answer.
You're welcome. Okay, anyone else, you're free to come up, hop on, ask me a question about, what we talked about. We have a question in the chat from Ahmed. What is the difference between Ashari and Hanbali understanding? Okay, so this is a whole other topic. I could probably have to do an entire talk just on this, but the essence is, the Hanbalis, like Qadi Abu Yala, they would say that God has an eternal speech that subsists in his essence, but the Hanbalis will say that it is eternal sounds and letters. Okay, so again, I'll repeat. The Hanbalis would say God's speech is eternal sounds and letters that subsist in God's essence. That's what they would say. And I talk about this in my thesis, and I'm going to talk about it in my book as well. Does anyone else want to hop on the stream? I can answer a question or two about this. Again, we're going to stick on topic, so that other question was really good. Don't be shy. You don't have to use your camera, obviously, and the stream link is pinned, okay? The stream link is pinned. You should be able to see it. And I know there are people watching on TikTok as well, but I can't really keep up with both of these things at the same time. So feel free to come up if you want. There's a stream link that I've posted. You can hop on, ask your question. Don't worry, nobody bites over here. Somebody said there's no resemblance between the words and letters, but the meaning stays intact. Stop straw manning. Okay, well, again, I'm not straw manning. I'm just showing you exactly what Ibn Taymiyyah says. Now, you can say that if you want to say that the meaning is intact, okay, no problem. But then you can't really criticize the Asharis for their view. If all you're saying is that the divine speech in God is the meaning, right? You can't really go after the Asharis then. So let's see if there's other things going on here. We have a question here. As a Christian, I see a lot of similarity between the Ashari idea of divine speech and the Word of God or Logos. Yes, there are similarities. There are similarities here. Okay, it's not superficial. Okay, there are similarities between this. Time doesn't permit me to go into the whole thing, but for example, you may find some similarities between how Thomas Aquinas talks about the eternal Logos or the Word of God. Okay, Thomas Aquinas's view, and how Asharis talk about the eternal speech of God. Okay, they both talk about these as subsisting in the divine essence. And I did post on Twitter about this. Let me see if I can find my post. But I did talk about this on Twitter, where there is some intersection between Aquinas view and the Ashari view. Let me see if I can locate it. I had posted excerpts from that. I may not be able to find it. Let's see. Okay, here we go. All right, I got it here. All right, I'm going to put my Twitter on the screen and we'll look at this. Okay. So again, the question is there similarity between the Ashari view of divine speech and the Christian view of the Logos as the eternal Son of God? All right, so I'm saying that there is some correspondence. We have somebody here, but it says device not connected. So Bobby, I don't know if you can hear me, but it says device not connected. So I'm not sure I could bring you up. Yeah, it won't let me bring you up until you connect your device. While we wait for that, I'm going to share my screen. This is just my Twitter feed. So I did post something, all right? So I wrote to Shadi al-Masri. As you know, some of the Asharis were criticizing the Christian Trinity, and I felt that that critique is not really up to par, because what the Asharis criticize in the Christian Trinity, they themselves can be liable to the same problems. What do I mean by that? So some of this I already mentioned, but take this for example. So the Asharis say that the divine attributes subsist in God's essence eternally. Aquinas says that the Son and the Holy Spirit subsist in God's nature eternally. Asharis say God's knowledge is a subsistent, uncreated attribute. Aquinas says God's eternal, subsistent knowledge is a subsistent relation. So there is some similarity here. Let me try to find it. So this is from Ghazali. Okay, just to show you guys, I'm not making up my critiques, right? So Ghazali says, we claim that all of these attributes subsist in God's essence, and none of them could subsist in something other than his essence, whether the attribute is in a receptacle or not. So that's very clear. The attributes subsist in God's essence. Okay, that there's no one can really go against that. Okay, next we have Aquinas. Okay, so Aquinas says that the Word of God is not an accident or a part of God, who is simple, nor something extrinsic to the divine nature, but it is something complete. It is something complete, subsisting in the divine nature and coming forth from another, as any word must be. Okay, and he goes on to say that the word of the divine intellect is the Son of God, while God, whose word he is, what we call the Father. So Aquinas says that the Son of God, which for Christians is the Word of God and the knowledge of God, subsists in God. That's what he's saying. We have the similar thing over here. Right here, he's talking about the Son of God, who is the Word of God, subsists in the divine nature and is co-eternal with the Father. This is very similar. It's not identical, but it's very similar to the Ashari claim that God's attribute of speech, God's attribute of life, God's attribute of knowledge subsists in God. I mean, here, we'll go back to Ghazali, right? All of the attributes subsist in God's essence. So yeah, I think there are some similarities. Is it the same doctrine? No, but there are relevant similarities, which makes the Ashari attack on the Trinity weak and subject to, a sort of like a tu quoque type objection. All right, so that's why so I think that the questioner was up to a point. Okay, we have again, Bobby, you've come to my stage, but your device is not connected. Bobby says, I see this is in the chat, I see a distinction between the not creation that is God and the creation that is not God. Do any Muslim traditions discuss or make this distinction? Can it be that the not created God is revealed by means of creation? No, I don't think, apart from Ibn Arabi, most of the Muslim theologians, that they're not going to say that God is revealed in his creation, but they'll say things like God's knowledge is revealed or God's speech is revealed. Okay, so they're fine with saying that God reveals his speech, his uncreated speech, by means of created letters. The Asharis say that. The Maturidis say that. The Asharis and Maturidis say that God creates sounds and letters and words, and they signify uncreated meanings. They have no problem saying that. All right. Does anybody else want to come up to the studio? We have a pinned link over here, right? So the pinned link will give you a StreamYard, and you can come up and chit chat about this stuff. Let me see if we have any comments on TikTok. I'm just looking at your guys' thing now. So, do you believe? Okay, some of these questions are irrelevant. Most of the TikTok stuff is irrelevant. I know that you guys couldn't see the full screen. That's the best I can do right now. I wasn't able to get the whole thing on full screen, so. All right, not much going on TikTok, so that's fine. Okay, we have someone else who's come up. I'm going to put you on the stage. All right, hello, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
I'm good.
Okay, yeah, I have some words regarding what you said about Ibn Taymiyyah and yeah, what he says about the voice of God, that it doesn't resemble anything of the created ones. I think personally what he does mean is that not that the voice itself doesn't resemble, but that the modality of it doesn't resemble the ones of the created ones. Actually, this is also the view of Imam Bukhari, as far as I have read it in one of his works, beside the Sahih collection. Hello?
Yeah, yes. So I've even seen statements attributed to Ahmed ibn Hanbal where he speaks of God speaking with a voice or a sound.
Yeah. So I think they don't mean that that the voice itself doesn't resemble, but I think they are meaning the modality, the kayfiyah.
Yeah, the issue with this is that Ibn Taymiyyah, like I've read him several times, he simply says that the sound and the letters that God speaks with do not resemble those of the creation, like in any way.
Okay, that's in that case it would be
But
something.
he does say what he did say, and it was on my slide, is he says there are analogs. The word in Arabic is nadir. There are nadir analogs of the uncreated words and the created words. But he doesn't explain what that is.
Okay, yes. I think personally what he does mean with uncreated is that, perhaps according to him, it doesn't make any sense to say that God does create the sound in his essence and then brings it out.
Yeah, he creates it in his essence, and then a creature hears it, like Gabriel heard it, maybe Moses heard it. Again, he doesn't tell us, though, how a creature can hear God's voice, but he must believe that it's possible. Let me also add this other, we have someone else here named Raf. Hello, Raf, how are you?
There you go. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Yeah, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah. Is it lagging, or can you hear me clearly?
We can hear you, but you're coming a bit low on volume, that's all.
Okay.
Turn my sound up.
So yeah, I mean, I am a Christian, and I just happened to catch your stream. I think I've seen your debate with Jake, and like before the other Christian said, I think Christians largely would agree to, they'd share your sentiments, I guess. But in terms of the Islamic position, is you insist that God is unknowable, but then you have hours and hours of you explaining the unknowable. So how do you reconcile, like, the Quran being the speech of God, but the speech of God being unknowable?
I mean, it really depends on which theological school of Islam we're talking about, because, for example, the Asharis will say that God's essence is unknowable, but actually God's speech is somewhat knowable because he reveals his speech. Asharis will say that God's attributes are somewhat knowable because variously divine created entities in creation, they tell you a little bit about God's attributes. So it really depends which school we're talking about. And
you're Ashari.
Me?
Are you? Yeah.
No, I'm not Ashari, no.
Right. So I was asking your position. How would you reconcile?
Well, I believe God is unknowable. And I don't like to describe God positively.
No, I'm saying with regards to God's speech being unknowable and the Quran. I think that's what you typed in the stream.
Sorry, I don't know what you're asking me. Are you asking me about the Quran or why? Like,
No, you're saying it's God's speech and the Quran.
Yeah.
the Islamic position is the Quran is God's speech, but
Well,
God's speech is unknowable. So how do you
no,
reconcile?
so this is a bit of a oversimplification. Okay, so if you go back and watch from the beginning,
Yeah.
I talk about how for Asharis, there's God's speech, and then the Quran in Arabic, it's a created revelation of God's speech. It's not identical to it.
Okay, sorry, I missed the.
Yeah,
Initially, was going to watch from the beginning, but then I seen you.
Yeah. You if you watch from the beginning, because I break this whole thing down basically.
Okay. So it's your position that the speech of God is knowable.
Yes, I mean the Asher, like the majority position is like the speech of God is knowable. Now, if you believe God is unknowable, then somebody could say the speech of God is created and therefore it's knowable. Other people will say if God is unknowable, his essence is unknowable, but his speech is knowable. His attributes are knowable. So there are different ways that Muslims think about these matters.
And I think perhaps to use the right language is is like nothing created. Is that the right way to explain?
It depends. So some people say the speech of God is not created. Others say the speech of God is created.
I was asking your position.
No, I believe the speech of God is created.
Eternally created. I'm trying to.
In a sense, I mean I believe in eternal creation. So there is an eternal creation of God, and you can symbolically refer to that as God's speech. And then there's like a temporally created speech of God, which is like revealed in time, which gives people access to the eternal speech of God. That's basically what my theology is. But for me, the speech of God, both the eternal and the temporal, both are created.
I'm not qualified in any sense to go into this in depth. But I mean, just to critique you on that a bit, it will make the speech of God dependent on creation, wouldn't it? If it's eternally created and dependent and coexisting within creation. So, like with Moses.
So the eternal speech of God in Ismaili theology, it is an eternal creation and it's dependent on God.
But like with the case with Moses exists within a created realm, and so you're saying God's eternal speech is dependent on the created.
No, it's not dependent on Moses. It's dependent on God.
No. If it's eternally created and Moses had to be the recipient of it, then he was eternally dependent. I think it's a contradiction. If it's eternally dependent on the created.
Moses being the recipient in Ismaili theology, all it means is that Moses reached a level of spiritual rank where his soul got access to the eternal speech of God.
But we have access to the same.
Yeah, we have much less access. We have a little bit, but Moses got
we have
more.
We have exactly the same speech Moses had access to.
No, we don't.
It's the Quran cites what Moses heard, doesn't it?
Well, the Quran is actually, I mean, the Quran is explaining this symbolically. Moses in Ismaili theology, Moses didn't actually hear a voice.
You're saying he heard the meaning.
Yeah, and he had like his soul realized, like he understood in the depths of his soul something about God.
So I mean, but that's what I'm saying. The meaning then exists dependently on the created being.
No, but I don't think the speech, for me in Ismaili theology, the eternal speech of God is not just a bunch of meanings. It's the universal intellect.
But yeah, I hear how you frame it, but I'm saying in terms of the principle of God's independence from creation.
Yeah, God is independent from creation, but God's speech is a creation in Ismaili theology. So there's no issue there then. God's speech is created, it's dependent on God, and all the other creations emanate from God's speech. So all the different creations have a relationship to God's speech, which is the first creation.
Right. Yeah, this is this is where it gets complex.
And in fact, the entire plan of creation, like everything that will happen, that can happen, all of that is already embedded in God's eternal speech. Like the whole archetypes, blueprints of creation.
Yeah, but that's where it gets interesting, because in that codependence or correlation with humans, you have evil. And so God had to create the scenarios for evil for his speech to be relevant.
So for evil, I would, if you're interested in our answer to the problem of evil, you should. I have a book chapter on my academia page, which is like the Ismaili response to the problem of evil, and you'll find that in there.
But I mean, I think this is where, for as a Christian, it makes sense. The Christian worldview makes sense. It's, in Christ we have God revealed perfectly, and even the Quran admits to this. Sinless, perfect, divine, of divine origin, and God speaks, or spoke in a perfect way in a way we understand, in His Son. And but the Islamic position is like you provide like the Philo and these men, these great thinkers, Aristotle and Plato. They provided frameworks to understand God.
Well, to be fair, Christians used Aristotle and Plato as well, right? I mean,
but not to the degree which is principally relevant to faith.
I think you did. I think the whole Christian formulation of the Trinity as three hypostases sharing one ousia. This language is not biblical. This language is from Greek thought.
Yeah, but
this is Neoplatonic and Platonic language.
Absolutely, but it's
Aristotelian language, right? So
yeah,
your own dogmas are defined, like your own creeds have Aristotelian Platonic language in them. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's a problem in a religion using terminology and concepts from Greek thought. I don't think it's a problem.
Yeah, and that's why as a Christian, I don't agree to the use of that, because the Bible makes it clear that God has His word in Christ is the best expression of who God is. And so if you want to know God, all He is, all that He's the express image of God. So we look at Christ, and there's a perfection there. But where the problem of using Neoplatonism or Philo is for Islam is when you're trying to describe what is unknowable. And that's where I'm trying to that's why I try to get reconciliation.
Do you believe God is knowable?
Absolutely.
Like, do you believe God's essence is knowable?
Absolutely.
Then God's essence would be limited.
No, it wouldn't.
Yeah, because the human mind and the human heart is finite. So if you say that God's essence is knowable, that means
it depends. It depends.
Being encompassed by a finite human.
This is where like logic and faith and the supernatural, they disperse, because if God is unknowable, then religion, there's no point of having faith.
Of course. Well, what does faith mean to you? Because I don't. When you say faith, what does that mean for you?
Faith is, as the Bible defines it, is the evidence of things not seen, substance of things hoped for. So there is a substance. There is. This is, I think, Hebrews 11.
Do you think faith is supposed to contradict logic or not be in line with logic?
I think there's an echelon. There's a. I don't want to take too much of your time, but I think there's. God makes it in such a way that there's a degree to which He can be known, and that's why I said absolutely, because we must be certain the knowledge of God in Christ comes with a certainty. That, or as Paul says, as the Bible says,
so let me put it this way: do you think God is fully knowable or just partly knowable?
I think in Christ we see the manifest expression of God. So in terms of who God wants us to know, what God wants us to know of Him is fully expressed in Christ. So you see the love, you see the mercy, and so exactly what God wants us to know is manifested in Christ. So in that sense, it's the full expression of God's revelation of Himself to man. But in terms of other aspects of Him,
so even then, you would have to admit that God's essence is not fully revealed in Christ.
I don't have. We don't have. This is where you'd have to. This is where logic begins to contradict faith, because we don't have sufficient information to negate.
If something is illogical, as far as I'm concerned, it's just not real, I could never adopt a belief that goes against logic.
Yeah.
Contradictory.
Well, that's, I mean, to answer your question, you're saying Christ is not the full expression of the knowledge of God, but I'm saying where that contradicts faith is because God says He is. So you'd need evidence to prove that that's not the case.
Or you think God said He is, and you've interpreted a passage to this idea that you have, but maybe you've misinterpreted it.
Exactly. There's the passage, but then there's how you interpret it, right? Like without, like, scripture isn't like, no, but like if everyone read the same scripture, they wouldn't, like, sure, they all kind of come to a similar idea, but not every person comes to this exact same idea. So
there are imperatives and indicatives in the Bible, and that Christ is the Word of God revealed is both explicitly and implicitly stated, and it takes, as Christians, the Spirit of God to make that revelation clear. Like in the Mount of Transfiguration, you have Moses and Elijah, and God says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him," in a sense that refers to him as.
So, Raf, look, thank you for coming, but this stream is not really about Christianity, so I'm going to park this discussion. But thank you for coming up. You're welcome.
Could you quickly just you're smiling?
Yeah.
Is that you? So could you just like in summary explain how you reconcile just just state it again, just I want to be clear, the Word of God and the Quran, how do you reconcile?
Sure. So for Ismailis, God eternally creates the first creation. That first creation is the top of creation, and that first creation is the highest level of understanding that any other creation is going to get. Okay, the Quran in Arabic is a guidance that ultimately comes from the first creation, and it's mediated by the Prophet. And the Arabic Quran contains commands, guidance, a way of life that will enable human beings, properly interpreting this, to return their souls back to the level of the first creation.
Right. Okay. I'll probably catch up on your stream to get full understanding of some of what you said. But yeah, cheers. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care.
Hey,
Hi, Amir. How are you?
Oh, are you talking to me? Sorry?
Yeah. How are you?
Good. Assalamu alaikum. Just wanted just to sort of pick your brain on a couple things. Are you so you're familiar with, like, so there's this argument that's sort of been brewing in the background, basically.
Okay.
You know how the Salafis, how they say there's like they believe in like different harfs of the Quran, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now,
well, Sunnis do, right? In general.
Well, Sunnis do, yes, but this argument specifically formulated against like those who reject like the kalam nafsi, kalam lafzi distinction.
Okay.
And then so we have someone, so say like they believe in these 7 haraf. You could simply just ask them what differentiates like the 2 harafs, because both, like, do they believe in one Quran or do they believe in multiple Qurans? Because they're going to say this is just one Quran, correct?
Yeah, Ibn Taymiyyah says, I don't know if you saw my stream, but he says there's only one Quran in God, like in God's self.
Exactly. And so, sorry, I missed it because I was at work today. So
No, that's fine. You can catch it up. I think you'll
exactly, like that's the good thing is I'm about to go to the gym, so I'm just gonna be listening to it. But
yeah, I'll read you what he said. He says that this is Majmu'a al-Fatawa, volume 12, page 75, 76 of like probably the archive.org version. The Quran does not multiply, and then it says nafsihi. It could mean in itself or in God's self. It's not clear to me, so I've left it blank. But the Quran does not multiply like in itself or in God's self through the multiplicity of the recitation of the reciters. Only that by which they recite the Quran multiplies. Then he says, whatever is multiplied and emergent in the servants is created. The Quran in his self, in its utterance, lafz, and its meaning, ma'na, is that which God spoke, and Gabriel heard it from God, and Muhammad heard it from Gabriel, and Muhammad proclaimed it to humankind. The Quran is singular, and it is the uncreated speech of God.
it's singular.
Yes.
Exactly. That's perfect. Because then you could just ask the question, because there's only one Quran, you would have a logical problem of what I call like the Salafiyya, right? Like you have one harf that's not identical to the other harf, both of them still Quran, and then both of them still being different. Right?
Yeah.
Like I could formulate, like, obviously, so they're gonna have to do a couple of ways to get out of it, which is the same things. Like if a Salafi agrees with this, and they're going to have to, you can make the same mere argument that they make to the the LPT, and then the same solutions that the Christians will have, like Joshua Sejuwade and a couple of the other ones have certain ways to get around it, right?
Okay.
Those same ways, which they say are invalid or illogical to get around the LPT, are the exact same things they're going to appeal to, sort of like a relative identity view or something like that, to get around this logical mere argument for the Salafi view.
So let me try to respond on their behalf. Okay, just as a thought experiment.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so what they could they could make this move. Okay, so they could say, all right, the concept of the ahruf, the 7 ahruf, it basically means that according to the hadith that you guys have, right? Gabriel, so we could say this: God spoke the Quran, and all of the ahruf, let's say there's 7 of them, God spoke all of the ahruf. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So now God spoke all the ahruf, and because Ibn Taymiyyah defines the Quran as like that which God spoke, right? All of the ahruf are part of the Quran spoken by God, and the Muslims, for whatever reason, have only preserved like one of those harfs.
Okay, yeah. So we could, a rebuttal to that would simply just asking, like, is the Kalam Allah composite or is it simple?
Oh, okay. But here's the issue.
And then you can go down that
We
route.
can say it's composite. He actually says it has. Again, if you watch my thing, Ibn Taymiyyah says that God's kalam, which begins to exist, has sound and letters.
But don't they take that to be an uncreated sound and letters?
It's uncreated. But remember, for Ibn Taymiyyah, uncreated only means subsisting in the divine essence. It doesn't mean simple. Exactly. It doesn't mean eternal. It just means it's inside God, which of course raises whole questions about like maybe God really is spatial,
Well, then that leads to composition. Like, okay, so this is an argument, sort of like the whole kalam, like this uncreated kalam that Musa alayhi salam hears with his ears, his literal ears.
Correct.
Once you ask, like, so I was having this discussion with someone on Twitter, and they were telling me, like, basically whatever sound is, like, to be honest, for me, like, it becomes unintelligible what their view on hearing and sound is, right? But whatever it is that's sound, that's leaving the uncreated that of Allah, the essence of Allah, and is being captured by the eardrums, right, and being collected in the ears of Musa alayhi salam.
Yeah.
This thing that's leaving, firstly, it's going to lead to contingency, right? Like firstly, composition. Because remember, the Ibn Taymiyyah view of composition requires separation, which I disagree, like with his mereology.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you. But
And
to be fair, the classical era Asharis and the classical era Maturidis, they have the same defense. They say, yeah, well, the attributes are not separable, so there's no composition. But they make distinctions between them, and Ibn Taymiyyah also makes distinctions.
That's true. That's true. I would say it'd fall more in line with the later Maturidian creed, but accepting divine simplicity. But in this case, like, I guess we have something separating from the essence of Allah and entering creation, right? So, I mean, again,
he won't say that. Ibn Taymiyyah will not say, although to be honest, he hasn't really, figure this out, but he says the Quran is in God's nafs, like the one Quran that God spoke is in God's self, right? But he also says Gabriel heard it, okay, and then Gabriel will recite that Quran with created sounds, and all of us are reciting the Quran emitting created sounds, but the original Quran is in God. That's what Ibn Taymiyyah says. But the question I raised is, and you should watch my thing because it'll give you all these more arguments. Ibn Taymiyyah says there's no resemblance between God's sounds and our sounds.
Yeah.
So now I don't even know if we're talking about the same Quran. Like the divinely spoken Quran could be some like wholly different. It has no resemblance to what we have, like what we recite. And I think that's a fatal problem.
No, you're right. I think that's...
And they fall prey to this two Quran polemic that they launch against the Asharis. The Taymis fall prey to the same thing.
Well, that's it. Like, to me, when I first came across this, like, it became almost self-evident that, like, the distinction is needed and required. But, like, all the discussions I've had and from what I've read, I don't know how, like you could make I think you could make a lot of arguments, right? You could even make the argument because like they say that in order for someone to speak, it must come from that person, correct? Come from within that person.
Who says? Who are we talking about?
The Taymiyans.
Yeah, so the Taymiyans and the Asharis agree that speech is qa'im, subsisting within the nafs of the speaker. They both agree. Where they disagree is for the Asharis, speech is a ma'na, like a sort of a meaning entity.
Yeah.
For Taymis, speech is sounds and letters.
Exactly. So here, I think, like, you could even make like an identity argument, right? So before he speaks, say, because I think they're going to say that the kalam, the speech and the sounds and these things that we hear, these things are essential for God. Everything in God, because they even say like the sifat fi'liya, like the actions of God subsist in Him, and they're essential.
They do, yeah. Or they call them the voluntary sifat, but yes, correct.
So, couldn't you make an identity argument saying He's not the same God?
I actually did that today on the stream.
You did? Okay.
Yeah, I said the divine essence is a substrate for temporal divine actions. So I said, before God spoke the Quran, the divine essence is in a certain state where it's not a substrate for that speech. But after he spoke the Quran, the divine essence is in a different state because now it's the substrate for the Quran. So the divine essence is actually changing.
Exactly. And have you also made the perfection argument from that?
No, I haven't. I mean, I was just making an argument like.
Oh, okay. Basically, like,
yeah.
Like, you could say that perfection is lost or just unclear what perfection is, because if we say that God is perfect, right? And this is sort of what negates change for any for God, is because if he's perfect the way that he is, any sort of change, he either becomes more perfect or less perfect.
Less perfect.
In which case, in the case that he grew in perfection, he was not perfect before, or at least as perfect as he is now, right? And then you could make the same, case vice versa.
Right.
And then I think you can make an argument from contingency. I think they accept it, right? Like accepting the sifat fi'liya and not accepting necessitarianism, right?
Yeah, I would ask them: are the sifat fi'liya or ikhtiyariya, are they contingent or necessary? I mean, if they're contingent, then God is contingent because he has all these contingent things subsisting in him.
Exactly. And if they're necessary, they agree with Muhammad Hijab, and they might get takfired by Jake.
Yeah, there you go.
That's it. Okay, Jazakallah khair. I'm gonna go to the gym. I'm gonna listen to the rest of the stream, but Jazakallah khair for the stream.
Yeah, you're welcome. No problem.
Wa alaikum salam.
Wa alaikum salam. Mr. Gilani or Gilani? I don't know what you prefer.
Tomato. Doesn't make a difference. Assalamu alaikum, Dr.
Assalamu alaikum. Gilani sounds more authentic, but in my family we have Gilani. So.
Oh, there were a lot of most of my Ismaili friends. They say, "Are you Ismaili?" I'm like, no, I'm Shia, but I'm a 12er, but not Ismaili. So I get that a lot in my community. There was a couple of things. Now, you mentioned the word subsist. You see, now Atharis, they play with this word in a really strange way, and it's becoming like exhausting. So when they say subsist, I say, oh, so it's a ziyada. It's an addition to the essence. They're like, no, it's not an addition. It's just co-eternal. Right. And I'm like, okay, so is it ungrounded independent reality aside from the essence? And they're like, no, it's just co-factual dependent on the essence. So am I getting this correct, Dr. Khalil? So we have like a little mice in that little wheel, and it's running, and so essence on attributes and attributes on essence is like a circle, co-factual circular dependency. Is that how it is?
Okay, it's a good question. So, firstly, are they talking about the action attributes that are temporal, or are they talking about other attributes that are like eternal?
No, just the relation of attributes in an ontological sense to the essence. So,
no, but which attributes?
All of them, 99, right? Let's say.
Well, remember, the Salafis divide them. They have some attributes that are eternal and others are temporal. So.
Okay, so let's say Qadim, eternal, the real.
Okay, let's just say eternal attributes.
The seven mother, Sabha. Okay, the
right.
Seven.
They call them the 7 Imams as well.
What?
Yeah. Ibn Arabi, he calls those 7 Ashari attributes the 7 Imams.
Okay, interesting.
It sounds rather Ismaili, doesn't it? So.
I did not know that. Okay. Yeah. So okay.
So here's what you should do.
Yeah.
I'm going to put something on the screen. This is an article that's relevant to what you're talking about because I get I hear this from them as well. So Jake actually said this in one of his 10 post debate videos against me, right? He made 10 videos, and in one of them he said that and it took him the 10th video to get to this point. So he said, the divine essence and the divine attributes are counterfactually dependent.
Okay, so what is that?
Okay, so he's saying that the existence of one of them entails or implicates the existence of the other, and it works both ways.
Okay, so khulu, so if one ceases to exist, the other is gone.
Yeah, but the answer that Jake gave, he called it counterfactual dependence, but counterfactual dependence is a statement about these two things based on knowledge. Okay, it doesn't tell you the ontology of the dependence. It just says that if you know that one exists, then you know the other exists. That's counterfactual dependence. So it's from the perspective of our knowledge. This is also known as like modal dependence.
I don't know, man, because you
Okay.
see,
So Kit Fine, there's this good article here by Kit Fine. Okay. And Kit Fine basically says that modal dependence, which is what Jake is talking about, modal counterfactual dependence, this is an inadequate account of what is really going on. Okay? And he says here, when necessity is metaphysical, the sense of dependence will be metaphysical as is required here. So simply saying that, okay, if I know that X exists, then it's necessary that Y also exists. That doesn't tell you deeper, does X depend on Y or does Y depend on
or is
X?
it the other way around?
There's an example, okay? Consider Socrates and the number 2. So given that 2 necessarily exists, it is necessarily the case that 2 exists if Socrates exists. But we don't want to say that Socrates depends on 2. You see, there's a difference between the first one over here is like more of a modal dependence. Okay. If Socrates exists, then 2, then 2 must exist.
How many kind of dependencies do we have here? I thought dependence. Like
no. So you, when you say dependent, you mean ontological dependence.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
But when these pseudo philosophers are playing with you, they try to get away from ontological dependence, and they want to throw these other kinds of dependence which don't have anything to do with ontology. Okay, so the point is, Kit Fine, who's a philosopher in this tradition, okay, he has basically pointed out that the modal construal of dependence is not good enough. It doesn't tell you enough. Okay, and what we really need to be talking about is essences, like the essence of X is dependent on the essence of Y, and so on. So if you simply say God and his attributes are counterfactually dependent, you're not answering the question. The question we have is, where is the ontological dependence? And simply saying counterfactual doesn't answer the question.
If they negate ontological dependence, then that would allude that they believe attributes are identical to the essence.
Well, that would be one of their only remaining moves to make, which of course they don't want to.
Yeah, like there's no other choice. It's either that or that.
Yeah. So we need to ask which one of these is constitutive and which one is consequential.
What's the name of the scholar that you mentioned?
Kit Fine.
Kit Fine. Okay. Kit Fine.
Yeah.
Kit Fine books. Okay.
So Kit Fine, here's the whole article. So he basically says in here that like modal dependence, saying, oh, X and Y are modally dependent, it doesn't really answer the question. This is the article right here. It's called Ontological Dependence.
It'd be nice if you can actually send me that. That'd be great.
Yeah, just remind me. I'll send it on WhatsApp or something. So anyway, if they simply say, oh, it's counterfactual dependence, like you should say, sorry, that's not answering my question. That doesn't tell me what I'm asking you. Because it doesn't.
Okay, Dr. Khalil. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.
All right, assalamu alaikum. If you want the paper of Kit Fine and you know me on WhatsApp, whoever's in the audience, just send me a message and remind me, and I'll send it to you. All right, I think we've gone long enough. I thought this was going to be short, but instead we went for 2 hours and a half. So I think I will leave it here. Thank you all very much for joining us, and I hope to do more streams. So I actually want to do a series on divine simplicity, and maybe I'll start that next week or something. We could do a whole bunch of streams on divine simplicity. I think this is, from an Islamic perspective, there's just not enough. There's not enough coverage and analysis on Muslim divine simplicity. So everyone take care. The video recording will stay up, and if you missed it, you can catch up.